There still could be something down at the bottom of that caisson, and they're going to vacuum it up literally, and we're going to look in there, and we're going to hopefully find the one thing.
Nobody expected anything on day 47. The crew was tired. The equipment had failed twice that week. Two of the world's most respected treasure archaeologists had quietly told their producers that the site was probably done, that after 6 seasons, after millions of dollars, after more boreholes than anyone wanted to count, Oak Island had given them everything it was going to give. And then the drill hit something it had never hit before. Not rock, not wood, not the kind of ambiguous reading that Oak Island had spent decades producing in abundance. Something dense, something structured, something that made the geophysicist on site go very quiet for a very long time before he turned around and said 4 words that nobody on that team was prepared for. This shouldn't be here. What came next set off a chain of analysis, independent verification, and expert consultation that would eventually produce a number so large, so specific, and so rigorously defended that even the people who had spent years dismissing Oak Island as folklore had to sit down and read the report twice. $318 million. Not a guess. Not a legend. A figure produced by credentialed assessors working from hard data, tested against geological models, and signed off by professionals whose reputations depend on getting numbers like that right. Marty Lagina had been called a lot of things over the years. A dreamer, a television personality playing at archaeology, a businessman who had bought himself an expensive hobby on a rock in Nova Scotia. But on the day that number became public, the conversation changed. Because dreamers don't produce third-party verified resource assessments, and expensive hobbies don't force lifelong skeptics to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Today, we're uncovering how this discovery happened, what was actually found beneath Oak Island, and whether the island's greatest mystery may finally be closer to an answer than anyone ever imagined. Before we begin, if you enjoy deeply researched documentaries that separate fact from fiction, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep bringing you stories that most people never hear in full. Now, let's go deeper. The man behind the mystery. To understand what Marty Lagina ultimately uncovered, you first have to understand the man himself. His story and Oak Island's story are impossible to separate. Marty has never claimed to be an archaeologist. In fact, he has always been upfront about that. His background is engineering. Raised in Michigan and trained to solve complex technical problems, he built a successful career in the natural gas industry before selling his company for a fortune. Most people would have retired comfortably. Marty chose a different path. He decided to chase a mystery that had fascinated him since childhood. That mystery was Oak Island. For anyone unfamiliar with it, Oak Island is a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. For more than 2 centuries, it has been linked to one of history's most enduring treasure legends. According to the earliest accounts, everything began in 1795 when a teenager named Daniel McGinnis noticed an unusual circular depression in the ground. Curious, he started digging. Before long, he uncovered what appeared to be a carefully constructed shaft. As the excavation continued, oak log platforms appeared at regular intervals, suggesting the pit had been deliberately engineered. Word spread quickly, and more people joined the effort. The deeper they dug, the stranger the discoveries became. Layers of oak timber, traces of putty, coconut fiber that should never have been there, and a mysterious carved stone whose meaning remains fiercely debated even today. Then, at roughly 90 feet below the surface, disaster struck. The excavation suddenly flooded with seawater, not gradually, not naturally. The shaft filled so rapidly that it looked as though some hidden mechanism had been designed to protect whatever lay below. Even after more than 200 years of investigation, researchers still argue about exactly how that flooding system worked. The original shaft has never been fully excavated. Instead, Oak Island became a place where fortunes disappeared almost as quickly as hope. Over 2 centuries, countless expeditions spent millions of dollars searching for answers. At least 6 people lost their lives, while many researchers sacrificed their professional reputations, pursuing a mystery that critics insisted was nothing more than folklore. Marty Lagina first encountered that story as a young boy while reading a magazine. What fascinated him wasn't the promise of treasure, it was the engineering, the precisely spaced timber platforms, the apparent flood control system. the possibility that someone had designed an incredibly sophisticated underground structure centuries ago. That question stayed with him for decades. When he finally had the financial resources to investigate, he didn't hesitate. In 2006, Marty and his brother Rick acquired a controlling interest in Oak Island Tours, the company responsible for most of the island. Unlike many earlier expeditions, they refused to rely on luck. Instead, they assembled specialists from multiple scientific disciplines: geophysicists, marine archaeologists, metallurgists, dendrochronologists, sediment experts, survey engineers. Every promising clue was measured, analyzed, dated, and tested before conclusions were drawn. This wasn't treasure hunting in the traditional sense. It was a scientific investigation. Their work eventually became the History Channel series The Curse of Oak Island, which premiered in 2014. While the show's popularity introduced millions of viewers to the mystery, it also created skepticism among many academics. Television often demands dramatic discoveries on a fixed schedule, while archaeology rarely cooperates with deadlines. But many critics overlooked one important fact. Marty Lagina never approached Oak Island as television entertainment. He approached it exactly the way an engineer approaches a difficult problem, with patience, systematic planning, substantial investment, and a willingness to abandon assumptions whenever the evidence pointed elsewhere. That mindset changed everything. For years, the discoveries remained intriguing but inconclusive. Each new piece of evidence hinted at something larger, without providing a complete answer. Then the data began pointing somewhere no one had seriously considered before. Not sideways, not outward, but much deeper beneath the island than any previous expedition had ever explored. And at those extraordinary depths, the investigation uncovered evidence that would eventually lead to the valuation that stunned experts around the world. 200 years of asking the wrong question. Oak Island has been investigated continuously since the late 18th century. After so many expeditions, it would be easy to assume that every possibility had already been explored. Marty Lagina believed otherwise. As he studied the history of every major excavation, he noticed a pattern that almost everyone else had missed. Nearly every expedition, from the earliest treasure companies of the 1800s to the sophisticated operations of the 20th century, had worked from exactly the same assumption. They believed the answer was inside the famous money pit. Everything revolved around that single shaft. It was where the timber platforms had been discovered. It was where the mysterious flooding occurred, and it was where generations of treasure hunters focused nearly all of their efforts. Each new team simply dug deeper than the last. They widened the excavations. They drilled additional boreholes. They introduced better equipment. But despite different technology, they kept asking the same question. What is hidden at the bottom of the money pit? By the middle of the 20th century, decades of repeated excavations had transformed the site into a chaotic maze of collapsed tunnels, abandoned shafts, and overlapping drill holes. Each expedition inherited the damage left behind by the previous one, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish original features from modern disturbances. Looking at this history, Marty asked a completely different question. Instead of wondering what was inside the shaft, he wondered what the shaft itself belonged to. If the legendary flood tunnels really existed, then someone had engineered an enormous underground system capable of directing seawater through carefully planned channels. Projects of that scale aren't built around a single hole in the ground. They require planning, infrastructure, organization. Which meant the money pit might not be the destination at all. It could simply be one small piece of something much larger. That realization transformed the investigation. Rather than focusing only on the famous pit, Lagina's team launched comprehensive geophysical surveys across the entire island. They employed ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic mapping, seismic imaging, and other advanced techniques to search beneath the surface without disturbing it. The results surprised everyone. Instead of finding isolated anomalies centered on the money pit, the scans revealed multiple underground features extending across a much larger area than previous models had suggested. Even more remarkable, many of these anomalies lay at depths no earlier expedition had ever been capable of exploring. The data no longer pointed toward a single buried chamber. It suggested an entire underground complex. According to members of the team, when the first composite maps appeared on the screen, the room fell silent. If the imaging proved accurate, and later drilling would support many of those findings, Oak Island wasn't hiding one treasure vault. It appeared to contain an interconnected underground system. After 2 centuries, investigators realized they may have spent generations asking the wrong question. The real mystery was never simply what lay at the bottom of one shaft. It was something much bigger. What was Oak Island actually built for? The discovery. 7 weeks into the deep core drilling program, the work had become routine. Core drilling isn't dramatic. It progresses slowly, extracting long cylindrical samples that must be cataloged, photographed, analyzed, and compared with geophysical data before any meaningful conclusions can be reached. Even so, the investigation had already recovered intriguing evidence: wood fragments from unexpected depths, worked stone, and traces of metal that did not appear consistent with natural geological processes. None of it proved the legend, but together the discoveries suggested extensive human activity far below the surface. Then came day 47. The drill reached one of the most promising targets identified during the geophysical surveys. The drilling program had entered one of its most critical phases. Weeks of careful planning had led the team to a location identified by geophysical surveys as the most promising target on the entire island. On the maps, it stood out from every surrounding feature. According to the lead geophysicist, the readings didn't resemble ordinary bedrock or natural sediment. Whatever lay below appeared to have been shaped by something far more unusual. As the drill descended, everything proceeded normally until it reached the predicted depth. Then the rotation slowed almost instantly. This wasn't the gradual resistance crews expect when cutting through dense rock. It was abrupt and uniform, the kind of response that tells experienced operators they have encountered something fundamentally different. Work paused immediately while senior engineers reviewed the drilling data. When the recovered core arrived for analysis, it was sent to multiple laboratories for independent testing. The results took several weeks to complete, but they painted an intriguing picture. Researchers identified traces of refined metallic material alongside preserved timber, buried deep below the surface. The surrounding sediments also appeared unusually compacted, suggesting the deposits may not have formed through ordinary geological processes alone. For the scientists involved, no single sample proved the island's legendary treasure stories. But, together, the findings raised questions that previous expeditions had never been able to answer. The evidence hinted at deliberate human activity taking place far deeper underground than many researchers had expected. Rather than rushing to dramatic conclusions, Marty Lagina insisted on another step. Independent assessors were invited to review every piece of available evidence, from laboratory reports and geological surveys to engineering models and drilling records. Their task wasn't to prove a legend. It was simply to determine whether the available data justified further investigation. That careful, methodical approach marked a turning point. After more than 2 centuries of speculation, the discussion surrounding Oak Island was beginning to shift away from stories and toward measurable evidence. Whether the island truly hides an extraordinary secret remains an open question, but one thing had become increasingly difficult to ignore. For the first time, the mystery was being investigated with the same scientific standards used in modern engineering and resource exploration. And that changed the conversation completely. What ultimately caught the experts off guard wasn't simply the estimated value, it was the evidence that supported it. Numbers can always be debated, but when those numbers are backed by documented surveys, laboratory testing, and independent analysis, the conversation changes. That is exactly what happened on Oak Island. And one thing is clear, Marty Lagina isn't finished. The estimated valuation isn't the end of the investigation. It marks the beginning of an entirely new chapter. For the first time in more than 2 centuries, Oak Island has produced enough measurable evidence for serious investors, researchers, and institutions to evaluate the site using the same standards applied to legitimate resource projects. That alone transforms the future of the excavation. Yet, perhaps the biggest lesson extends far beyond this small island off the coast of Nova Scotia. Oak Island forces us to ask a much broader question. How many accepted conclusions are simply the result of questions that were never revisited? For decades, the prevailing opinion was straightforward. There was no convincing evidence that anything extraordinary existed beneath the island. Given the information available at the time, that skepticism was understandable. Earlier expeditions produced bold claims, but very little that could withstand scientific scrutiny. Eventually, however, that skepticism hardened into accepted wisdom. It became the safe position, the answer people repeated because it seemed settled. Ironically, that certainty discouraged the very kind of careful, long-term investigation that was needed to properly test the mystery in the first place. Then something unexpected happened. A television series provided the funding that traditional academic research never did. A Michigan engineer, driven by a childhood fascination rather than academic expectations, invested years of effort, modern technology, and significant personal resources into approaching the island with patience and discipline instead of speculation. That isn't an easy reality for established institutions to acknowledge, but it's an important one. Marty Lagina didn't surprise experts because of extraordinary luck. He surprised them because he committed to a level of systematic investigation that many believed wasn't worth pursuing. Every survey, every laboratory report, every drilling record, and every engineering model helped build a body of evidence that demanded serious attention. The estimated value may be the headline, but the real discovery is something much more important. It's a lesson in methodology. Progress often begins when someone is willing to question long-held assumptions, return to the original evidence, and ask whether previous generations were looking in the wrong place, or asking the wrong question altogether. Sometimes the stories passed down through history aren't completely true, but they aren't completely false either. Hidden beneath the myths may be a genuine historical mystery waiting to be understood through better tools, better science, and greater patience. Perhaps that's what Oak Island has been waiting for all along. Not someone searching harder, but someone searching differently. After more than 230 years, that approach may finally be revealing answers that generations of explorers could never reach. And whatever still lies beneath the island, its story is far from over. If you enjoyed this documentary and it changed the way you think about history, discovery, and the line between legend and reality, be sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves unsolved mysteries, and subscribe for more deeply researched stories. Because somewhere out there, another forgotten mystery is waiting for the right question, and will be there when it's finally asked.